Which is it?
I'm Zeb Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and today I'm with my friend, Professor Melissa Klapper, Professor of History and Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Rowan University. Thanks so much for coming.
Hi, Zeb. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, where we are in these micro episodes is in the 1880s, where in really the mid-1880s with Kaufman Kohler and the Pittsburgh Platform and Isaac Mayer Wise establishing Reform Judaism, separate from Orthodox Judaism once and for all, was a declaration of a synagogue form of American Judaism, one that historically always moved through the synagogue. One obtained kosher food, one was buried by the synagogue, schools were ensconced within the synagogue structure, but with the 1880s moving forward, American Jewish life, American Judaism, came out of multiple structures, not just the synagogue. We can no longer call it synagogue-based Judaism. And that's where your wonderful work has come in, where you have other historical actors who wouldn't have had agency within the synagogue and were able to take on issues that would not have been taken up by the synagogue. In the 1880s and especially the 1890s, what we see emerging with men and women, but particularly women, is a form of activism which is unprecedented in American Jewish life.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would argue that even earlier than that, when you take a gender perspective and think about women, the synagogue was not meaningful to a lot of American Jewish women pretty much since the beginning. It was certainly meaningful to many of them. And, we have lots of research about the presence of Jewish women in synagogues of a variety of flavors throughout the 19th century. But what you see, I think, really coming kind of blooming in the 1880s and in the 1890s is that the spheres of activity that many American Jewish women were already more interested in really became even more important to American Jewish life than potentially had been possible before, when the synagogue was still at the center, or at least the putative center. Although I do think that from the perspective of American Jewish women's history, it's a little hard to argue that the synagogue was the center of Jewish life for them, even before this period.
Well, certainly. My argument would be is that this improved agency allowed for a fuller discussion and opportunity for Jewish women.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that this discussion about the place of Jewish women in synagogue and community, the relationship between synagogue and community, was actually part of a much larger American religious history story at the same time period, where you had the so-called feminization of the church. That term feminization is very problematic, as scholars like our colleague Sarah Imhoff have pointed out. But the idea that, where do women belong? Is there power and is there agency coming out of a religious place or not, either a literal religious place or a more theoretical religious place? So that is a debate that is ongoing in the United States, certainly throughout the 19th century. And after the Civil War, it becomes that much more important to have these discussions. What is women's place? Especially given the fact that after the Civil War, it seemed evident to everybody that lots of women weren't going to get married, right? The men they were supposed to marry had just been killed in the Civil War, and then you were going to have this new group of women who, whether they liked it or not, and some of them might have liked it fine, but whether they liked it or not, were not going to be getting married and having children and establishing families at which they would be the center of everything, including the center of religious life as seen through the family. And so there's this larger discussion in the United States at the end of the 19th century about women's roles. And related to that, there's lots of things that are related to that. There's more opportunities for higher education for women. All kinds of colleges, women's colleges are founded after the Civil War. And also a number of state universities, usually land grant universities, were opened after the Civil War, and they were just coeducational from the start. And so there were far more opportunities for higher education, and Jewish women did participate in many of those opportunities. If you look at Jewish women in states like Montana or Minnesota during this period, a lot of the women I've written about who became activists went to the university, went to these colleges and universities. They didn't all go east to go to Vassar or wherever, or to Smith, places that had very small but did have Jewish populations. No, they went to the University of Minnesota or the University of Wisconsin or the University of Wyoming, wherever they lived, because these were available to women from the get-go. And then there's also way more women going into the workforce. both the new, as the kind of second industrial revolution hits, and there's far more people going into mechanized industrial occupations, women are part of that group, and especially in conjunction with the immigration that starts in the early 1880s, you have hundreds of thousands of working class women going into the workforce, women and also girls because of child labor. That's another big change that affects Jewish women's lives. And then you also have whole new professions opening up that were basically dominated by women from the get-go, like librarianship or social work a little bit later. And so there's all these changes, and all of them have a huge impact on American Jewish women. They're not operating in a vacuum, and their opportunities and their agency don't only come from a place within the Jewish community, it's very much the American setting as well.
In terms of activism and the types of activism, how did American Jewish women make their activism particularly Jewish, or did they at all?
They did. In many cases, they did. And again, as is often the case in American Jewish history, there's two sides to that. There's the Jewish women wanting something to be Jewish about their activism and starting all kinds of Jewish women's groups. I'll come back to that in a minute. But there was also the fact that they were excluded from the larger American women's club movement that was developing during this period, where you had all these clubs, many of which started off as social or sometimes literary clubs. So for instance, after the Civil War, having clubs that read Shakespeare, women's clubs that read Shakespeare, were very common. The other author, actually, that was a very common club topic was Browning. Robert Barrett Browning was an incredibly popular poet in the late 19th century. So you had Shakespeare and Browning clubs. But a lot of these women were becoming more socially conscious for all these reasons I've already started to discuss. And so the Shakespeare Club would start to think, well, if we want to do something in our community, how are we going to do that? And then that would lead to various kinds of public activism and to really blurring the lines and then blowing them apart completely between private and public activity. But a lot of those clubs were not open to Jewish women because of anti-Semitism, which was also on the rise during this period, in part in reaction to the waves of mass migration. So Jewish women sometimes had, they were influenced greatly by this club movement, but also weren't necessarily welcome in it. And of course, the classic example of this is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which by its very name was not for Jewish women. And of course, many Jewish women, not all, but many Jewish women were completely uninterested in temperance. This just was not their issue. It wasn't, you know, if you read Marty Davis's wonderful book, Jews and Booze, which is all about this. You know,
Greatest title that anybody in our field.
It is the greatest title. I'm always telling people that. Marty, if you're ever watching this, I'm always telling people it's the greatest title ever of a book, Jews and Booze. So Jewish women, many American Jews just were either involved in the liquor industry or just didn't want the government involved in regulating liquor in any way. So that's the mass movement of the American women in the 1870s, 1880s, into the 1890s, and Jewish women were just excluded. So therefore, they started to form their own groups. So there were, the classic example is the National Council of Jewish Women, which was founded in 1893. But even before that, before we get to that, which it is an extremely important organization that does not get the credit it deserves on many levels. But even before that, you did have, coming out of what already existed, ladies' auxiliary groups that were associated with synagogues, but weren't always. And, you know, the Jewish women who were teaching in Sabbath schools, many of those Sabbath schools were independent. They weren't all connected to congregations necessarily. And so there were already realms of activity that Jewish women were involved in that had a certain amount of independence. And in the very late 1800s, you also had synagogue sisterhoods. They don't use that term exactly yet, but that's beginning to show up too. So that Jewish women were replicating what they saw around women in their similar social, other American women in their similar social class, and replicating that within the American Jewish community. This is also a time of growth, as you say, of non-congregational spheres of American Jewish communal life. And so a huge number of organizations in general get founded in the late 1800s, the American Jewish Historical Society, the Jewish Publication Society. There's all these different groups, and women were involved with those. There were women members of the American Jewish Historical Society. It probably wouldn't have occurred to anyone then that, oh, well, let's have a woman president. That might be asking too much from the past, but women were there. They were present in all these things that Jonathan Sarna calls the Jewish Great Awakening. Women were there at the creation of many of those institutions. And so it's not surprising to find them getting involved with their own clubs. And there were certain kinds of catalyzing events, anti-Semitism, especially episodes like when the Seligman family was kept out of the Saratoga Springs resort. That was kind of a shockwave through certainly the upper class of American Jewish society. And it caused a lot of Jewish women to think about their relationships to their communities and to think about whether they should be active, not just in an internal way, just within the Jewish community, or start to think about things outside the Jewish community.
That episode in itself deserves, I think,
Yep.
a fuller treatment. It's sort of, it's a check mark in the 1870s, but there's, as you point out, the reaction to it was tremendous by all people, because it was outside the synagogue. So it was, who are we in these spaces, right? Men and women go to these clubs. If they can't be there, then I can't be there. Then what is it for us to form moving forward?
Right. And this is also, there was actually even, and some of the reaction to that almost led to, it didn't work, it didn't take off, but there was almost a little bit of a revival of an earlier form of the day school movement, where there were some Jewish communities that said, you know what, if our kids aren't going to be accepted, maybe public school isn't going to even work as a way that's supposed to churn out American citizens, no matter what their background. Maybe we should go back to thinking about full-day Jewish day schools. That it didn't go anywhere in the 1870s and 1880s, but there was a little bit of a revival of interest. And again, it really is because of anti-Semitism in this period, which is part of a larger xenophobia that results from just the entrance of huge numbers of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Many of them explicitly seen as being, quote, religiously undesirable, that is, they're Jewish or they're Catholic. And so all of this is all a very important context. So then in 1893, or really in 1892, when the planning started for what would become the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, there was going to be a World Parliament of Religions held there, which in many ways is a landmark of world religious history. When you think, it's just incredible the breadth of people who came there. It was certainly not all Christian, it was not all American. There were people representing various Eastern religions. Jews had a prominent place in the World Parliament of Religions, and there were Jewish women who did too. So that Josephine Lazarus, for instance, Emma Lazarus' sister, and Henrietta Zold both gave papers at the full World Parliament of Religions, not at the separate Women's Congress that was happening at the same time. But famously, Hannah Greenbaum Solomon, who became the first president of the National Council of Jewish Women, offered to help develop the program for the Jewish section, and was told, well, you can serve tea. And that ticked her off. And importantly, Hannah Greenbaum Solomon and her sister were the first two Jewish women accepted into the Chicago Women's Club. At this point, they already had nearly 20 years of experience with a women's club that used ideas about domesticity, that used traditional ideas about women and used them to get what they wanted in the public sphere. You're going to tell me that as a woman that I should take care of children? Well, then I should be running public kindergartens. You're going to tell me I'm responsible for keeping my home clean? Well, then I, the woman, should help design the sanitation systems for Chicago, what was called municipal housekeeping. The Jewish women were already involved in that outside the Jewish community. It's not surprising to see them organize groups within the American Jewish community as well. So you have synagogues, what were called sisterhoods of personal service in the late 19th century that were developing in Cherith, Israel, and New York, and in other large congregations, also in San Francisco, actually. So it wasn't just a New York or even an East Coast phenomenon. And you also had Jewish women's auxiliary groups that already existed in connection with synagogues that in some places, particularly in small towns throughout the interior of the United States, the synagogues were already closing, right? They were already losing population, but the Jewish women's groups that had been associated with them often did not close, right? They continued to do their good works out there in the community. And the National Council of Jewish Women becomes kind of the avatar of Jewish women's organizations in the United States. Like many groups, like many women's groups, it started with an explicitly religious and educational mission, and then very shortly thereafter turned into more of a philanthropic / social work organization very quickly.
So what were the types of issues which became anointed as Jewish women's issues?
Well, Jewish women were very concerned with education always, whether that was public education, private education for their children, or Jewish education. And actually the women in the National Council of Jewish Women were concerned about their own education. They all felt like they didn't know enough. One of the major parts of their original mission was to educate themselves so that they would know more about Judaism, both to do a better job in educating their own children. That certainly was part of it, a very traditional role, but also so that they themselves wouldn't be embarrassed to deal with other American women of their similar class status who seemed to know a whole lot more about their own religious heritage and history than these women did. which does tell you something about the lack of success of the Sabbath school movement throughout the 19th century. Some of these women had been to those schools and still felt that they just didn't know anything. And again, all these major organizations starting in the period, JPS and the American Jewish Historical Society, were also about improving the level of Jewish knowledge within the larger American Jewish community. So that was one major thing that they were concerned about. And then they were also concerned about, about religion in the home, about making their homes more religious places. That does not necessarily mean more traditionally observant places, but that their homes should be explicitly Jewish spaces. And some of them just weren't sure how to do that. And here's another story. I'm currently doing some research on Hannah Greenbaum Solomon, so this is why she's coming up. She's also just a fun person to talk about. But there was a big fight about who was going to be the first president of the National Council of Jewish Women, because there were people in the organization who were more traditionally observant and people who were a lot less traditionally observant, like Solomon. Rebecca Kohut was the leader of a more traditional contingent, and
Rebbitzin. She was.
Yes. Although she was important not just because she was a rabbi's daughter and a rabbi's wife and a rabbi's stepmother. She had her own. She was one of the most.
She owned that space in that position.
Yeah. And she was one of the most Jewishly well-educated women in the United States at the late 19th century, literally. I mean, she was right on up there. So there was a fight who was going to be the president, and Solomon seemed like a natural choice, and she'd been so involved in the original founding meeting and in Chicago, where this organization came to life. She helped write the Constitution and the mission statement. But she actually was from one of these classical Reform synagogues where they sometimes observed Shabbat on Sunday. I mean, she was not traditionally observant. Nor did she have any desire to be so. And there were arguments about it, and people said, well, we need someone who consecrates, the Sabbath. And she said famously, I consecrate every day, which is a really good response. And so she won the election. And it didn't mean that she had no problem with people who were more traditionally observant. It just that she didn't feel that she needed to do that, or that American Jewish women needed to feel that. So there's also, all the debates that are going on in the larger American Jewish community during this period show up in Jewish women's organizations. So it's really an amalgamation of issues in the American women's history of the time and also in the American Jewish history of the time. And you see that also in the American Jewess, the magazine that started in 1895 by Rosa Sonnenschein, who actually left. She was also at that Chicago World's Fair, and she left saying, there's a place. There are enough Jewish women in America now. There's a place for a publication just for them. And you see there's more traditional and less traditional perspectives in there. She's got male writers, but a lot of women writers. Sonnenschein was very committed. It's
fascinating. I mean, as you're saying that, what's very, very, as fewer and as other newspapers in the regular regional Jewish press, like the Israelite and the American Hebrew, are becoming less welcoming to people who are not like their editors.
Yeah.
Very different than the case would be in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. The American Jewess does become a clearinghouse of all sorts of different views. Yeah. It maintains that legacy in American Jewish life, whereas its peers, men, are being less welcoming to alternative opinions.
Of course, it only lasted 4.5 years, so I'm not sure, it may not have been a winning strategy exactly. There are lots of periodicals come and go. It's not so surprising that it came and went, but it really is a fascinating periodical. And for those of you watching, if you're not aware of this, it's digitized and you can read almost every issue of the American Jewess. The easiest way to get to it is through the Jewish Women's Archive website.
Yes.
And it's searchable also. It's a great resource. So eventually, but within just a few years, the National Council of Jewish Women is showing concern for the large numbers of immigrants coming into Jewish communities all across the United States and really getting involved there too. And you could say it's defensive, that they're doing that because they're worried about anti-Semitism and they want to make sure people are taken care of. That's probably fair, but it's not their main motivation. The main motivation is not social control. Okay, there might be an element to that, but it's also, they really cared. They were very concerned, and they were especially concerned about women who were traveling alone. And so the National Council of Jewish Women, like its counterpart in the Italian Catholic community, the St. Vincent de Paul Society, worked out this enormously complicated system, a system that we complicated now when you could text people to get information across, of having representatives at the docks and at train stations where Jewish women traveling alone would be met by somebody respectable. and not get whisked off to the evils of white slavery, or just even have trouble finding their relatives when they didn't know the language very well and couldn't read the signs. And so a Jewish woman traveling by herself who got off the ship in New York would be met at the docks by the National Council of Jewish Women reps. She would actually be released to her custody if there was no family member to pick her up. That woman would, if necessary, take her to the train station, put her on a train, talk to the conductor about her, and then she would get off in, wherever, Cleveland or Chicago or Detroit, where she would be met by another National Council of Jewish Women rep who would take her where she was going. This was an enormously complex system. And that's the kind of thing they were doing, really like practical, philanthropic, social worky type things. And they're pretty early to do it. Again, they're not the only ones. There was the system in place for Italian women as well. But it's significant that these groups felt the need to do this. So yes, it's protective. They're trying to protect their own reputation and the community's reputation, but it's also, just as a practical thing, really helpful. Really helpful, and it made the process of immigration safer for a lot of people for whom it was not necessarily so safe. We've all heard the horror stories. So that's the National Council of Jewish Women in this period. The other thing that's really significant that I want to mention is the increasing activism of labor activists during this time, right? I mean, many American Jews did go to industrial cities where they were immediately swallowed up by the industrial maw of terrible working conditions. For women in particular, like just constant sexual harassment, constant, and Jewish women were quick to organize in these environments. A lot of them came with political experience and radical ideas from Eastern Europe. And even if they didn't, though, their work conditions often turned them into activists. And so that's something else that we think of more as a 20th century thing, but it starts in the late 19th century. As soon as Jewish women are going to work in these industrial environments, they are immediately turned into labor activists.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.